Welcome back, everyone. Let's jump right in and take a deeper dive of the cybersecurity assessment tools led by Dave White of Axio. Dave?
Thanks, Betsy. Thanks, everyone. Looks like we have a couple of people still on break. I had a great break. I hope that you did as well. I was just joking with my fellow presenters today that I'm now fueled by a turkey and pimento cheese sandwich. So let's get going. So we're going to start in the deep dive. We're going to start by taking a closer look at the Cybersecurity Scorecard. And for those of you who are new to the Axio platform, I'm actually going to invite you to follow along, and we'll go through the process of getting your account set up. I'll start by spending a little more time on getting you into the platform. So if you want to follow along, excuse me, open a browser in another window. We recommend Chrome, or I recommend Chrome. A lot of our development team uses Chrome, so the Axio 360 site is optimized for Chrome. We do not support Internet Explorer. We do support other browsers. If you try to access it with a browser that's unsupported, you'll get a note. And you can start by going to publicpower.axio.com. I'm going to go there with you now. And I'm going to log out so we can restart together. So the first thing you want to do if you're new to the platform, now some of you, because we've seen the registration list, some of you already have accounts in the Axio 360 platform. So you can use those accounts and you can sign in at either of these URLs using your existing credentials. If you are new to the platform, you browse to publicpower.axio.com and click the register button. When you click the register button, it'll ask you for an email address. So let's just pretend that I'm registering here, and I'm going to register at dave@utility.org. So you want to use your work email address. So we've set up company accounts for every participant in the webinar, and your company account is associated with that top level domain in your email address, which is why we ask for that information during the registration process. So then you want to type in a password. We require that passwords be at least 12 characters long. So we do not have a complexity requirement. This is consistent with NIST's current guidelines for passwords. So type in a password. I recommend using a phrase. I'm going to, since I have to type it twice, I'm going to try to pay attention here. All right, so once you've typed the password twice, you click on the register button, and we then send you an email containing a verification code to the email address that you used to register. That email should arrive pretty quickly. Some people find it in their junk box. If you're using the other inbox feature on Outlook, you might find it there. So check all of those places. And then it'll come from axio.com. And then you'll need to enter that verification code here to prove that you have access to the email address that you've used to register. So I used a completely fake email address, so I don't have a verification code. You can click resend if you don't find it right away. And then if you still have trouble, please send email to support@axio.com. That's support, SUPPORT, @axio.com. And Erin Mitchell, who's on the line with us today, will receive that email, and she can help you get registered if you run into any difficulty. So I'm going to return to the login page and reopen my log into my demo account using my work email address. And so this is where we were when we ended the shallow dive treatment of the Cybersecurity Scorecard. So, and I already covered how to create a new Cybersecurity Scorecard assessment. remember that the Cybersecurity Scorecard is an assessment that's based on those 51 basic activities defined in the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, C2M2. And those are the 51 activities that the model recommends any organization with any dependence on technology perform, right? So if you have, so basically everybody, right? These 51 activities are for everyone, and they're presented in the scorecard in that 14 multiple choice answer format in a wizard. Now, when you're thinking about completing the scorecard, one of the things that you want to consider is which part of the organization you're going to take a look at. And for most utilities, in my experience, it makes sense to look at the IT side of the house and the OT side of the house, if assuming that there is an OT side of the house, or the industrial control system side of the house, because oftentimes managing cybersecurity in IT versus OT, managing cybersecurity in IT versus OT is a very different endeavor. And so I often find that, that doing an assessment for each side of the house makes sense. If you're in an assessment and you find yourself saying, well, you know, yeah, we're doing that for over here, but we're not doing it for over there, and so I'm not sure how to answer it, that's a strong clue that maybe you should back out and create two assessments, one for the over here part and one for the over there part, so that you can answer it truthfully for those, with those two different perspectives. Many organizations and many utilities end up with multiple assessments to get a full snapshot of their cybersecurity posture. So that's a little bit of scoping. Now, I want to talk a little bit about who should be involved. So Nathan, if you could just unmute for a second. Many of your members are very small. I mean, that was a great statistic that you shared, that more than 50%, slightly more than 50% have fewer than 2,000 meters, right? That's a great indication of size. So for your public power members, what have you heard from them about who they typically involve when they're completing the cybersecurity scorecard?
Yeah, and I hate to say this, but it depends. You know, for the larger organizations, they have a cybersecurity team or a, you know, in-house team that does that. You know, they would focus on bringing all the right people to the table. For a typical member of, you know, the smaller size, you know, there's going to be one person doing this as 10% of their job. So they're going to be sitting down, doing their best to look at the questions and just truthfully respond. Do I even know, you know, what's going on in this, you know, this practice? If I don't, you know, be truthful about it. I don't cover that. But if you know, an entity is doing something on it, give yourself some credit and and mark it off. But you know, you might have to talk to a city, you know, IT staff if that's what you're dependent on is the city infrastructure for a municipal. But you know, whoever might have you know, some sort of impact. Usually the superintendent, general manager, you know, get senior level folks involved. But yeah, it is going to be a varied group for the municipals.
Great. Thanks, Nathan. So this demo with today's date, demo 09/01/20, is the scorecard that we created on the earlier segment. And so I'm gonna reopen this, and to reopen, remember your assessments are gonna show up here in this left panel on your dashboard, and you can reopen any assessment by clicking on its name. And you can also share an assessment by clicking on that sharing icon. If there are other people registered from your organization, in other words, from your top level domain, then when you click in this window of invite people, you'll see their names here, right? If we do have the ability, so we do have the ability for you to share with someone outside your organization. For those of you who've been using the platform for a while, that is a new feature. It is a feature that we have to turn on because you know, it does, you should have some security consideration before you do that. And so if you want to share it with somebody outside your organization, you can reach out to support@axio.com and we can help you get that set up. When you do share, know that you can share in a read-only mode. So if you're just sharing for information, if you want to show somebody your results, but you don't want to let them change your results, then you can share it in read-only mode. And so that's sharing. We can also create milestones here. Remember that in the Axio 360 platform, every time you change an answer, we record that change with a time and date stamp. So at any point in the future, you can get in the time machine using this new milestone feature and look at what your score was on a specific date, right? So next year sometime, you could say, hey, I want to see what my score was at the end of Q3 2020. Go in and create a milestone for September 30th, 2020, and you'll see exactly what your score was on the last day of this quarter, right? So that's the milestone feature. And with that, remember you can click on the assessment name to get back into it. And because we haven't completed the 14 questions, we pop right back into the wizard mode, and we're on the question that we had open when I ended the earlier overview. So the second question here is on configuration baselines. And I'm gonna, for this part of the deep dive, I'm gonna quickly run through the 14 questions so that you get a sense of how the questions are structured and what the questions cover. So the second question is on configuration baselines. This is about establishing a baseline or a common way that assets are configured before you put them into service in your utility. So I'm going to say that we do this and that we use it to configure assets at deployment. So we've defined a baseline because we want for assets that we want to be configured in the same way. And we do use those baselines to configure assets at deployment. Remember, you can take notes here as well. So that's configuration baseline. The third question is on access control. And this is about controlling both physical access and electronic access to IT and OT assets and systems. And keep in mind that you can answer all of these. These can be performed in an ad hoc manner, and you select all the answers that apply. So if you're logged in, you could be completing your initial cybersecurity scorecard as we go through here. So do we create accounts for people that require access? Yes. Do we require credentials? Yes. Have we developed access requirements, both physical access requirements and electronic access requirements? I'm going to say yes. Do we use those to figure out who can have access? Do we revoke access when it's no longer needed? And do we remove accounts when they're no longer needed? So access control, another one of those cybersecurity basics. And that's question 3. Question 4 is on vulnerability management. Remember that vulnerabilities in the broadest sense are just weaknesses or flaws in IT or OT systems that can be leveraged by adversaries. They can also be weaknesses or flaws in your protective measures around those. So you could have a vulnerability associated with the strength of your password requirements, for example. That's another kind of vulnerability. A lot of the vulnerabilities that we talk about from a cybersecurity perspective are vulnerabilities that can be addressed by implementing patches. And so the basics for vulnerability is having information sources that we can go to get information around vulnerabilities, actually using those information sources to gather information and figuring out whether it applies. Having an inventory, which was question 1, really helps you understand whether a vulnerability applies to your system, and then addressing those vulnerabilities. And then the 5th question is on threat management. This is very distinct from vulnerabilities, and Chuck Speak gave a fantastic overview of the threat landscape for utilities when he spoke this morning. And so here, again, we want to see as a basic, have you identified any sources for threat information? And do you gather threat information and figure out whether it applies to your organization? And then do you address important threats, including strengthening your security protection? So, Chuck mentioned business email compromise, that sort of criminals tricking you into sending money to the wrong place or paying the wrong person. That's number one on the FBI cybercrime watch list right now. And so understanding that threat may cause you to look inside your organization and say, well, what kind of additional controls should we have to make sure that we don't get tricked into sending money to the wrong place? Because organizations across the United States are losing a lot of money through that right now. So that's threat management. The next question is on risk management. So risk is a higher order sort of concept than threats and vulnerabilities. And it really involves identifying something that if it happens would cause a meaningful impact to your organization. And so, for example, you might identify the risk of credential theft or password theft through phishing as a major risk. And then you might mitigate that risk by implementing anti-phishing training or tests, or work with someone from outside the organization, like Intuitive, to help you implement that program. So having a risk management program is a great foundation for cybersecurity. Question 7 is about the ability to detect an event. Now, event is something that happens that could have an impact to the cybersecurity of the organization's IT or OT systems. And so to find cybersecurity incidents, sort of things that need a response, we need a bigger funnel. And so we look for events, and then we scan those events to understand what may require additional attention. The basics here are to have some central point of contact that people can notify of events, report those events, log them and track them, have some criteria to understand whether an event should be declared to be an incident. So, if any given Monday morning, you find that you have 3 users that have forgotten their passwords over the weekend, but on one particular Monday morning, suddenly you have 50 users that have forgotten their password, that's an incident, right? That sort of norm of 3 users every Monday, those are events, those are worth tracking, right? But having 50, that's probably an incident. And so understanding criteria to determine whether you want to declare something to be an incident, and then using that criteria to look at those events that you're tracking, are important elements of event detection covered in the scorecard. Incident response. Really, if you've escalated an event to an incident, in other words, the event has passed through that test or that threshold that you've created, then you've declared it to be an incident. Do you log those? Do you have a response team? Do you have the ability to respond in a way that limits impact and achieves a restoration of normal operation? And do you know who you may need to report that to, either internally or to external trusted parties like the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or maybe to 7 states or other interconnected utilities? So there are lots of, it's good to think about in advance who you might need to inform of incidents if they occur as part of your incident management. And APP has that great incident response playbook that Nathan talked about earlier that you can get on the APPA website. That is a great resource for building incident response capability. If that's something that you're working on, I highly recommend that you get that document. Operational resiliency is about returning to normal operation after an event. And so utilities, in my experience, and I think I doubt anybody on the phone will disagree with me, but I think utilities are really good at returning to normal operations after weather events and other major events. So this is a muscle that utilities have like almost no other organization, because you guys flat know how to respond to a weather event. And so this is about having that same kind of muscle for returning to normal operations that after some cyber event. So this is about knowing what you need to do, having a sequence of activities to get back to normal and reliable operation, and then having those developed in a continuity plan so that you can execute those plans without having to make them up on the fly should you need to. Monitoring cyber system activity. So this is about logging and monitoring. This gives you the data that you need to do that detect question that we covered earlier. I forget which question that was, but this is an important sort of partner practice or partner question to that detection practice. So have we enabled logging on assets that are needed? Do we review our logs? And do we monitor our operations for irregular or anomalous activity? So think back to Chuck Speak's presentation and that sort of his picture of that security operations center. That's sort of the dream for a monitoring system. But if you're a really small utility operation and you're not yet participating in some shared services like those that sorry about that. We had a recording interruption, but if you're not yet participating in that, there are scrappy ways to do this that even small utilities can accomplish, and sort of networking with your fellow or peer utilities is a great way to sort of understand how other people are doing it. That's a very valuable technique for planning improvements. Cyber threat and event information sharing. So information sharing has been a major topic of discussion by federal agencies and other industry associations for a number of years. This is just sort of banding together and making sure that if we see something in our utility, we're sharing it with other folks, because sometimes you might see something and it might just be happening to you. But if you and like 15 of your neighbors are seeing it, then it's probably a bigger issue. And there's no way for us to know that unless people are actually sharing information. And so this is about information sharing. We provide cybersecurity information, we collect cybersecurity information and provide cybersecurity information to a variety of places. And we've actually made somebody responsible for that in our organization. Supply chain risk has been a major topic of great concern over the last couple of years. And this is a difficult one, right? This is hard because we're in the era of mass specialization. So there are a lot of things that you're probably outsourcing that you might have at one point done inside your utility, and understanding the risk to your operations that stem from those dependencies on third parties, or giving access to or vesting data in a third party is what this question is all about. So, and we're looking at, in the C2M2, the C2M2 sort of views every organization as a link in a supply chain. And then it looks both up that chain and down that chain. So we want to know both that you know who your important customers are, and that you know who your important suppliers are, and that you've identified risks from your supply chain, including an analysis of how an event in either a customer or, and that's particularly relevant if you have major customers that have some electronic connectivity to your system, how an event can propagate from a vendor or a customer into your system. You're looking for those sort of weakest links. What would happen if this went down? Maybe if they happen to go down. And then D here is that you establish requirements when you enter into relationships with suppliers. So those would typically be expressed in a contract. Supply chain risk, workforce management and cybersecurity training. So this is about equipping your folks to be the front line as part of your protective measures, and also to make sure that you've got folks on staff, either as contractors or as employees, who understand how to operate cybersecurity, how to build a cybersecurity program, and put in place cybersecurity protection. So, and it starts with identifying responsibilities, assigning those responsibilities to people, providing training to employees and to contractors, cybersecurity awareness activities like anti-phishing training, for example. Personnel vetting. This is making sure that the people that you're giving access to your assets, that you're making sure those folks have the right sort of level of trust that you can reliably count on them acting in a way to protect your assets and your operations. And then addressing cybersecurity concerns during terminations by, for example, removing physical and electronic access. Key consideration is sort of managing that workforce dimension. And then the final question here is on cybersecurity program management. And this is, do we have a strategy for our program? Do we have resources for our program? Do we have senior management sponsorship for our program? I know in most organizations, without senior management sponsorships, it's really difficult to get anything to happen in a reliable or repeatable way. So that's a critical element that we address in this question. And then, do we have a strategy to keep our IT systems isolated from our OT systems? Now, you might have noticed that I've clicked on every item. So for this, I'm going to say none of the above for this one so that we don't have an absolutely perfect score when we go to the dashboard. And when I hit finish here, it takes me out to that dashboard, and you'll see that I scored 100% in 9 out of 10 domains, and that 10th domain on cybersecurity program management, because I clicked none of the above there at the last minute, I scored 0% because I answered negative for all of those. And that gives me a score of 279. It also shows, I said I would say more about this benchmark comparison. So this blue dot is your current score. So that's 279, just like in the speedometer up there. And then your target for the scorecard is 300. And why is that the target? We set that as the target for you whenever you create a scorecard, because the recommendation from the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, the C2M2, is that you, as any organization, the recommendation is they implement these 51 things. So since that's the recommendation of the model, we go ahead and set that target for you of full implementation for every practice that you've answered in the scorecard. And so you can see that target there. This diagram here, I'll dwell over it so you can see the numbers. That diagram is called a box, plot, and whisker diagram. You don't need to remember that. What you should remember is that it shows, for all of the data that we have from folks who've completed the scorecard, that the minimum score we've seen is 10 points. The maximum score we've seen is 300 points. This white line in the middle is the median. So 50% of the scores are 220 and below. And the other half of all the scores we have are 220 and above. So that's the 50th percentile or median. And then that 146 is the 25th percentile. So 25% of the scores we have for scorecards are below 146, right? And then we have 25% between 146 and 220, another 25% between 220 and 255, and then the top 25% between 255 and 300. So if this was your score, you could say to your management, hey, we just completed the scorecard and we scored in the 4th quartile. We're in the top 25% of utilities that have completed the scorecard. And we're going to follow the recommendations that Axio has made, that APP has made in collaboration with Axio from our dashboard here. And notice that the final recommendation is to expand to a full C2M2 assessment. So I'm going to call on Nathan again quickly here to just say, Nathan, how have you seen members using this information from the dashboard and also in the report that I showed earlier?
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and yeah, that you did answer one of the questions not covered, so that you weren't the perfect organization, because we know that not everybody is the perfect organization out there, and we've really heard from members, on the low side, that they said, "Oh, I've done terrible," No, you've not done terrible. You've set a baseline of where you're at right now. Look at that baseline, use those scores where you missed, and find solutions to that. And that's, you know, what hopefully you'll get to when you talk to 7 states and you download all the resources that we've developed. But then also the members are using this to say, okay, here's where we're at in comparison to the other utilities, other public power utilities similar to us, and where they're at. We want to be in line with where everyone's at. We don't want to, shoot way over, spend a lot of money on stuff if we don't need to. Let's at least get to where everyone else is at, and it's set them up for a good program and a good goal to reach.
Thanks, Nathan. One of the things I really love about the scorecard work with APPA and your members is that we actually designed a 3-stage process for organizations to follow. And the first stage in that process is to complete the scorecard. And that's where you get your baseline on the basics. You can run a full improvement campaign. If your score is 150, then you should probably spend some time with these basic practices and get some of those foundations in place before you expand to the full C2M2, right? The full C2M2 is 312 practices. So we've covered 51 of the 312 by answering the scorecard. You can do a full improvement campaign. Notice when I reopen this, because I've now completed the wizard view, when I reopen it, I see an interface that looks a lot like that RC3 interface that I showed on the earlier demo, right? But these are C2M2 practices, and these are the 51 MIL1 or basic practices from C2M2, organized in the 10 domains of C2M2. So there's, for example, incident response. I can learn more about incident response. I can see the maturity indicator level 1 practices for incident response. And remember, I said that I was doing everything except for cybersecurity program management. In that wizard interface, when you say that you're doing something, we set the answer to that practice to be fully implemented. The C2M2 uses a 4-point answer scale: not implemented, partially implemented, largely implemented, and fully implemented. Fully implemented means we're flat doing that. That's what we're doing. There's no gaps, no improvements that we could talk about. Largely means we've got that covered. We're satisfied we've got it covered. There are some gaps. We don't consider those gaps to be material, but there are some gaps. So that's like an 80% answer, if you will. Partially implemented means there are material gaps. We're doing something, but there's some big gaps in how we're doing that we ought to address. So we're going to consider it sort of below the line. This is sort of the midpoint is kind of the line. So that's like a 20% answer. We're doing something, but we've got a ways to go. And not implemented means we're not doing that, right? If you're, and I've been in workshops where organizations have said, "Are you telling me people actually do that?" That's a really good indication that the correct answer for that is not implement, right? And so, and in my experience with C2M2, the not implemented is really easy to answer. Fully implemented is really easy to answer. It's debating over whether you want to say partially, we've got material gaps, or largely, we've got some gaps, but they're not material. That's the big debate that happens when you're answering these. And now that we've gone through the wizard mode, you can actually fine tune your answers for these MIL1 practices. If I jump forward to cybersecurity program management, you might say, well, it's not that we completely don't have a strategy. I'm going to say that we have that partially implemented. We are, in fact, I think we have some resources, but we've got some gaps there. Maybe I'm going to say they're not material. So you can complete an improvement journey at MIL1. Then you can jump back to the dashboard here. You see my score went up a little bit from 279 to 284. And then when you're ready to expand, you can click this expand button. Now, I said that APPA has designed a three-stage program for building your cybersecurity, a three-stage advice for building your cybersecurity program. And the first is the scorecard. The second is called the public power target profile. So when you are ready to expand to the full C2M2, one of the options we have available for you in the platform is you can select that target profile, which is sort of the second stage. So this is the recommendation from APPA for members that are now moving from the scorecard into the full C2M2. And if I select that and hit expand, one of the things you'll see is that now I have a different dashboard, right? So this is the full C2M2 dashboard, and I'll give you an overview of that very quickly. But I want to dive back into this assessment for a second, and you'll see now that on this progress bar up here, there are a lot of unanswered practices. Those progress markings on risk management, for example, say that, you know, I've answered a few practices. In fact, if I look over here, I've answered 2 out of 24. And I know that's right because there are 2 maturity indicator level 1 or MIL1 practices in risk management. And now you also notice that the target has been set for all of these. And the target is set based on that sort of second step. Now, you can go through and change that target. Remember, as you're answering these, you answer by clicking and you set the target by shift clicking, so you can change the target. But the point is that APPA target profile set a sort of midpoint target for you to start from as you start to use the full C2M2 in building a roadmap for your program. And back out to the platform, I'm going to show you what a full, so here's a C2M2 that you know, I've been working on for some time. And this has lots of milestones that I can bring up and show in that left wheel by clicking. So you can see when I first answered this way back when, I think I started this in 2017. My score was 536. Score today is 679, and my target is 881. So the full C2M2 is scored out of 1,000 points. And you can see my progress down here. Our development team hates me for this assessment because it's got so many changes in it and so much information in it because I've been using it as a demo since 2017. So whenever I try to open it on a dashboard, it gets this error. Don't worry, that error will go away. And in this case, it doesn't mean anything. But if you do see errors in red down here, you can always send an email to support@axio.com. So that's the full C2M2 interface, the same benchmark comparison for the full C2M2. We also provide benchmarks for targets, right? And because the Department of Energy has published a mapping from the full C2M2 to the NIST cybersecurity framework, we can estimate what your score would be in that framework by those 5 functions. Or if you click on the magic expando there, you can see it by subcategory for CSF, and that's what your score is in CSF. CSF is a popular framework for guiding cybersecurity. It only has 108 activities. So we have a lot of utilities that use our platform, and they plan improvements using C2M2 because it has 312 practices. It's a much more granular way to plan a program evolution. And then they report out on CSF using these familiar identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And that's a great way to sort of segue into the RC3, because the RC3 uses that same basic organizing principle of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover that was inspired by the cybersecurity framework. So I'm just checking to see if we have any questions. I'm not seeing any on my interface over here. So I'm going to go ahead and move into the
Hey Dave, before you do that, this is John. I just want to share one question that I didn't put into the facilitator interface. This was a question from the audience on supply chain, and if we had a module essentially focused on that for today. We don't have a specific supply chain module, but our presenters shared a bunch of interesting information. So I wanted to answer live and just let everybody know that what some of the folks on our side said. So there's NRECA is doing a lot of really interesting R&D work around supply chain. So check their website later this year, early next year, to see some of the results of that. The same with APPA. They've got guidance coming up on how to address NERC SIP. Again, that will be on their website later this year. And Chuck from Intuitive shared some bullets on some really interesting work they're doing around supply chain, where they were using AI to analyze huge data sets and create a scorecard that helps you identify individual risk for suppliers, overall risk, and that included cyber, but wasn't just limited to it. So I just want to share those resources, Dave. Sorry for the interruption, and thanks everybody for the questions.
Thanks, John. I just wanted to point out that in C2M2, there is a full section, one domain dedicated to supply chain and external dependencies management. It's called EDM, and you can access it in the platform by clicking on EDM. And this is the guidance from C2M2 that is associated with supply chain cyber risk issues. So let's move on to the RC3.